In 2002, a 16-year-old high school football star had everything ahead of him. He was 6 feet 4 inches, 225 pounds, a linebacker with Division I talent. USC was interested, he had scholarship offers, NFL scouts were already watching him. His future was set. Then a girl from his school accused him of rape, and everything disappeared. He was arrested. His lawyer told him to take a plea deal. He spent 5 years in prison and 5 years on probation as a registered sex offender. His football career was over. His life was destroyed. And then, in 2011, his accuser sent him a Facebook friend request. They met up. She told him she wanted to help him, and Brian Banks, who had lost everything because of her, did something incredibly smart. He recorded the conversation, and on that recording, she admitted something that would change his life again. This is the story of Brian Banks, and how one lie can destroy a life, and how the truth, even when it comes years too late, still matters. Brian Banks was born in Long Beach, California in 1985. He grew up in a tough neighborhood, but he had a way out: football. Brian was naturally athletic, big, fast, and smart on the field. By the time he got to Long Beach Polytechnic High School, he was a star. Long Beach Poly is a football powerhouse. It's produced NFL players like Willie McGinnis, Deshaun Jackson, and Juju Smith-Schuster. And Brian was one of their best. By his junior year, Brian was getting attention from college scouts. USC, the University of Southern California, one of the top football programs in the country, was recruiting him. He had a verbal commitment. His dream was coming true. Brian was 16 years old in the summer of 2002. He was about to start his senior year. One more year of high school football, then off to USC, then hopefully the NFL. Life was good. On July 8th, 2002, Brian was at school for summer classes. During a break, he went to a stairwell to make a phone call. A girl he knew, a classmate named Juanetta Gibson, was there. They talked, they kissed, it was consensual. Just two teenagers fooling around, nothing more happened. They went their separate ways. But later that day, a school security guard found Juanetta in the stairwell. She was disheveled, and she told the security guard that she had been kidnapped and raped by Brian Banks. The police were called. Brian was arrested that same day. He was confused, terrified. He told police that nothing like that had happened, that they had just kissed, that it was consensual. But it didn't matter. Juanetta had made the accusation. And in 2002, especially in a case involving a young girl, the accusation was treated as fact. Brian was charged with rape. He was 16 years old, still technically a kid, but he was big, 6 feet 4 inches, over 200 pounds. He looked like an adult. And the prosecutors were going to try him as an adult. Brian's mother hired a lawyer, not a great lawyer, not an expensive one, because they couldn't afford that. A lawyer who would do the best he could, but was overwhelmed and underprepared. The lawyer told Brian the reality of his situation. Brian was a big black teenager accused of raping a smaller, younger black girl. The optics were terrible. If he went to trial and lost, he could get 41 years to life in prison. But if he took a plea deal, he could be out in less than 5 years with good behavior. Brian maintained his innocence. He told his lawyer over and over that he didn't do it, that it was consensual, that there was no rape. But his lawyer painted a grim picture. On all-white jury in conservative Orange County, a teenage girl testifying that she was raped. Brian would be an easy target. The jury would convict him, and he'd spend the rest of his life in prison. The lawyer advised him to take the plea. Brian was 16 years old. He was scared. He was being told by his own lawyer that if he went to trial, he'd lose. So, on the advice of his attorney, Brian took the plea deal. He pled no contest to 1 count of forcible rape. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison. With good behavior, he could be out in less than 5. Brian was sent to California State Prison, a 16-year-old kid in adult prison. He was bigger than most men, but he was still a teenager. And he was surrounded by hardened criminals. Prison was brutal. Brian had to learn quickly how to survive. He kept his head down, he worked out, he tried to stay out of trouble, and every day he thought about what he'd lost. His football career was over. USC had revoked his scholarship the moment he was arrested. Every other school did the same. His dream of playing college football, of making it to the NFL, had died. Brian served his time. He was released in 2007, but his punishment was far from over. As part of his plea deal, he had to register as a sex offender. He had to wear an ankle monitor. He was on probation for 5 years, which meant he had strict rules about where he could go and who he could be around. He couldn't go near schools. He couldn't go near parks. He had to report regularly to his probation officer, and his name was on the sex offender registry, which meant anyone could look him up online and see that he was a registered rapist. Brian tried to rebuild his life, but how do you rebuild when you're a registered sex offender? He couldn't get a good job. Nobody wanted to hire him. He couldn't go back to school. He couldn't play football. His life was on hold, stuck in limbo, all because of a crime he didn't commit. And meanwhile, Juanetta Gibson was living her life. She had sued the Long Beach Unified School District, claiming they didn't provide adequate security, which led to her being raped. The school district settled. Juanetta received $1.5 million. Let me say that again. Juanetta Gibson received $1.5 million because she claimed she was raped at school. Brian Banks was in prison and then on probation, and Juanetta had gotten rich off the lie. Brian knew she had lied, but what could he do? He had already pled guilty. He had already been convicted. The system considered it over. Brian spent 5 years on probation, living as a registered sex offender, trying to survive. And then, in 2011, something extraordinary happened. One day in 2011, Brian was checking Facebook, and he saw something that stopped him cold. Juanetta Gibson had sent him a friend request. Brian couldn't believe it. The woman who had accused him of rape, who had destroyed his life, was trying to connect with him on Facebook. He didn't know what to do. Part of him wanted to ignore it. Part of him was furious. But another part of him saw an opportunity. Brian contacted the California Innocence Project, an organization that works to exonerate wrongfully convicted people. He told them what had happened, and they gave him advice. If Juanetta wanted to talk to him, he should meet with her, but he should record the conversation. Brian reached out to Juanetta. They agreed to meet. And when they did, Brian had his phone recording everything. They sat down, they talked, and Brian asked her about what happened back in 2002. Juanetta told him that she wanted to help him. She said she would be willing to talk to his lawyers. She said things had gotten out of control back then. And then, critically, she said something that Brian needed her to say. She admitted that they had been just playing around in that stairwell. She said no rape had occurred. She said she had made the accusation because she was afraid of her mother finding out she'd been fooling around with a boy at school. Brian had it all on tape. But here's where it gets complicated. Juanetta told Brian she couldn't go to the police or the court and recant her story. Why? Because of the $1.5 million settlement. If she admitted she lied, she'd have to give the money back. So Juanetta was willing to admit to Brian in private that she had lied, but she wouldn't do it publicly because she didn't want to lose her settlement money. Brian took the recording to the California Innocence Project. They took it to the court. And in May 2012, a judge dismissed Brian's conviction. After 10 years, 5 in prison and 5 on probation, Brian Banks was finally free. His conviction was overturned. He was no longer a registered sex offender. The moment the judge made the ruling, Brian broke down in tears. 10 years of his life had been stolen, but finally, the truth had won. The California Innocence Project held a press conference. Brian stood in front of cameras and told his story. He was 26 years old. He had lost his teenage years, his early 20s, but he was determined not to let the rest of his life be stolen too. And Brian had one dream left: to play football. In 2012, Brian Banks was 26 years old. He hadn't played organized football in a decade, but he started training. He worked out every day. He trained with former NFL players. He sent tapes to NFL teams. He went to tryouts. And incredibly, the Seattle Seahawks gave him a shot. They signed him to their offseason roster. Brian didn't make the Seahawks' final roster, but the Atlanta Falcons picked him up. In 2013, Brian Banks played in 4 preseason games for the Atlanta Falcons. It wasn't the NFL career he could have had. He was only with the Falcons for the preseason, but he got to play. He got to put on an NFL uniform. He got to step on that field. For Brian, that meant everything. It was proof that he could still do it, that the dream hadn't been entirely stolen. After football, Brian became an advocate. He worked with the California Innocence Project. He spoke about wrongful convictions. He told his story to help others. In 2019, a movie about Brian's life was released, simply titled Brian Banks. It starred Aldis Hodge as Brian and told his story to a wider audience. Brian used his platform to talk about the problems with the justice system, about coerced plea deals, about how defense attorneys pressure innocent people to plead guilty because they're afraid of worse outcomes, about how hard it is to overturn a conviction even when you're innocent. And he talked about false accusations, about how they destroy lives. Brian was careful to say that false accusations are relatively rare. Most sexual assault accusations are true. Victims should be believed and supported. But false accusations do happen, and when they do, the consequences are devastating. Brian lost 10 years of his life, his football career, his reputation, his freedom, all because of a lie. As for Juanetta Gibson, she faced consequences but not criminal ones. The Long Beach Unified School District sued her to get back the $1.5 million settlement plus interest. A judge ordered her to pay $2.6 million, but Juanetta declared bankruptcy and has reportedly never paid a cent. She was never criminally charged for making a false accusation. She was never charged with perjury. She faced no jail time. The woman who sent an innocent man to prison and destroyed his life faced no real consequences. Brian has said he's forgiven her. Not because what she did was okay, but because holding on to anger was destroying him. That level of grace after everything he lost is remarkable. Today, Brian Banks is in his late 30s. He works in advocacy. He's spoken to lawmakers about criminal justice reform. He's helped other wrongfully convicted people. He is also a life coach and nationally recognized public speaker. He didn't get the life he originally wanted, but he's made something meaningful out of the life he got. Brian Banks' story is about more than a false accusation. It's about a system that pressures innocent people to plead guilty. It's about how hard it is to prove innocence once you've been convicted. It's about the lasting damage of a lie. Brian survived. He rebuilt. He forgave. He moved forward. But his story is a reminder that words have power, accusations have consequences, and lies can destroy lives. Brian Banks lost 10 years because someone lied, and the person who lied never spent a day in jail. That's the reality, and it's a reality we need to change. What are your thoughts on his case? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe for more stories like this. See you in the next one.